we're going to turn it to Brian O'Looney, who is going to talk about what's going on in suburban areas around the globe. So Brian, I'm going to turn it over to you. Brian will talk for 8 or 10 minutes, and then we have some questions coming in. We have a few questions that are coming in on zoning, and we have other questions about demographics and things like that. So we will turn to Brian, and then we'll get to some Q&A. So if you do have a question, put it into the Q&A text function, or you can raise your hand, and at that point we will turn the microphone over to you so you can ask your question via audio. But Brian, welcome, and I'm looking forward to this.
Thank you. It's exciting to be here. Can you hear me, and can you see my screen?
Yes, and yes.
Wonderful. Okay. So good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to talk a little bit about what is happening with suburbanization internationally from our small window, from our professional practice at Torti Gallas, working in projects across the globe. Coming from an American perspective, when we think of the suburbs, we think of places like Levittown, the idea of the American dream, this post-war vision of the nuclear family that created the places like Levittown and that were removed and remote from the city cores. And so when thinking about what projects to present today, I thought about that distance of what's happening 25 miles outside of the city as we go forward. So when we think of our work in established communities in Anglo-European places like Australia or Ireland or Europe, I put up an Australian example here. They follow very similar cultural growth patterns, but the rules may be different, and what's emphasized may be different. In Australia, for example, planning is done at the state level, at the regional level, as opposed to the local level. So all planning there would be done at the level of Connecticut or Maryland, as opposed to at the town level and the city level. And that changes the way the development happens and the way things are processed. And there are other small adjustments that one has to think and listen for when we work in communities across the globe. For example, stormwater is handled very differently and in many ways more successfully in Australia than they are here, I think, in the States. And there's a lot that Americans can learn from looking at how other established Anglo-European cultures have expressed their development in the suburbs. Our firm is a multicultural firm. We have 20 nationalities speaking 19 different languages in our firm. So when we work internationally, we're very careful to listen and think in terms of what is appropriate where we work. And that is very different in the different cultures in which we operate. So for example, if you're doing housing in Latin America, security is very important. And the idea of a wall and a gate is part of what is considered a traditional home. Similarly, if you're doing commercial in India, the sidewalk is felt not as a place where pedestrians walk, but as an extension of the storefront. And so when we work in these communities, we're very cognizant of listening, but also thinking about the regional perspectives and what that means for how great communities are done locally, and therefore how they can be adopted and how our new work can be adopted and get acceptance and ownership by the folks who would use them. And finally, when we think about what's happening internationally, we have to understand that the growth curve is way different than what we're used to in the suburbs here today. Our work here is a little slower than what's happening in a lot of the globe. There's a big difference in scale and the pace of change in most of the world that's developing suburbs today. That work is also happening in two very different strata. There's a lot of work happening with expensive high-end housing, and then there's a lot of consideration given to the challenges of meeting the housing needs of the growing global population. And so the work that we've done internationally reflects those two strata. And interestingly enough, not a lot is happening. There's a lot of less consideration for what the core middle parts of society are being, how their housing needs are addressed. And that's a challenge. So for example, our work in Turkey, this is 20 miles outside of Istanbul, but 45 minutes to an hour because of the way their transportation network works. And this is a high-end housing neighborhood with a supermarket and a Starbucks in the hills, in the remote parts of in Zakirköy, which is just outside of Istanbul. Similarly, nearby there's another project we can show, again meeting the idea of those who are trying to remove themselves from the city cores and have a place to live away from the city. And we can talk about what that means in the COVID world today and how these places are growing. And then when you get closer to the city, we have developments that hit that bridge the strata, the societal strata. But what's really interesting is what's happening, what we find in the Middle East, for example, where 25 miles outside of Riyadh here, this is a plan that was done by Peter Calthorpe's office, but that we are helped to visualize and conceptualize, where they're looking to put 500,000 people down in that locale outside of town. And what does that mean? And how do you develop? Because it's very different than the American vision of the single family home. That's not how these places are being considered in other cultures. And so this is the idea of the whole society coming together on the central mosque. But the pattern of development, the increment, is much grander than what we're typically used to in America. And so this, we're going to highlight this one neighborhood to the south and show you the block structure, and then talk about the blocks and how that increment is expressed in building forms that are much more urban in an American worldview than what would be or what will be established in the quote unquote suburbs of Riyadh and the suburbs in India and the suburbs in China. And so when we look at that structure, we think about form and how does that relate, and how do these buildings adapt to the culture. In the Middle East, for example, we're learning from how their elevators operate, and that may be useful for us in future pandemics, where they have lockout elevators. When a family gets in an elevator, culturally, it's important for that family to go from the parking at the base of the building to their unit without meeting anyone else in the building. So that and that's a critical part of their culture, and all the buildings are designed for that. And there's more elevators because of that, because of the needs that would establish. And that kind of separation, we know of our clients here in the States who are building new high-rise buildings are looking at that kind of operations for their elevator, as well as other cultural influences on elevators that we can talk about. But this is the kind of form that we're seeing, at least in the Middle East. And so I'll leave it at that, and then we can get to discussion. Happy to talk about other influences on work, but that's my teaser for the conversation.